Hello, this is Professor JPS, and this is a streamlined lecture for Communication Arts 154, Film Study and Appreciation. This was be a lecture for April 23rd, 2020. We will be finishing up aspects of the French film The 400 Blows from last week, and some aspects of the French New Wave. And then we will dive into discussing Chapter 10. Oh, I think I just put in the title Chapter 11. I'm so sorry. It was Chapter 10, Ideology. So when you see the title of this particular, this one, I messed up the chapter number. Chapter 10, Ideology. And we'll talk a little bit about politics. This would have been a lecture for tomorrow, April 20th. And the film that we would see to talk about ideology is a fan favorite and an easy film to digest, of the film Forrest Gump, directed by Robert Zemeckis. First, let me discuss some aspects from last week's film. It's my genuine hope that a number of you were able to see the film. I know that this one might have been a little hard to find, and perhaps because it was in French, maybe you didn't look real hard. I don't know. It's up to you and your conscience. But I just want to go over some aspects of that particular film and to talk a little bit about what was very influential, how that film was very influential, and talk a little bit about the French New Wave of the 1960s. So just to condense a little bit from last week's lecture, you may remember that after World War II, in France, roughly speaking, 1945 through to the early 1960s, there was a fairly large and intriguing gathering of intellectuals who, in various other decades, would have been talking about literature or painting or other aspects of aesthetics. And in this particular decade, between say 45 and 55 or 45 and the late 50s, there became a very heavy intellectualization of motion pictures. And the key thing that came from this particular hotbed of intellectual inquiry was the film journal Cahiers du Cinéma, or if you like, Cinema Notes, and it was run by the fellow called André Bazin, B-A-Z-I-N. And André Bazin was a very, very committed scholar who was interested in understanding how motion pictures, more so than other arts, really helped to demonstrate a certain kind of what he referred to as emotional realism. Now, Bazin was someone who was interested in painting and literature and music and sculpture and all the rest. But for him, the most magnificent thing about movies is not only how realistic they were, as opposed to theater, which there's always the artifice of pretending, when the people on the stage pretending that they're in their own little world. Motion pictures could be shot in the real world. And motion pictures could get in close. And motion pictures could move the camera all over the place. And motion pictures could use other aspects to enhance the significance and the meaning of emotional connection the viewer has with the people on the screen. Sound effects and music and editing and camera angle and length of shot, all of these ingredients of filmmaking that the French called mise en scène. For Bazin, they were taking art into a new direction, right? Motion pictures moved. And for Bazin, not only was that movement very powerful, but it struck at a kind of emotional realism that made him feel as though motion pictures were meaningful and not just entertaining. And even more than meaningful, they were artful. And if you looked at certain directors whose particular kind of repeated themes and techniques used over and over and over again, well, Bazin and Bazin's followers started to understand this notion that movie directors were just as artistic. If you really looked carefully and really artfully at motion pictures, they were just as artful as painters or playwrights or musicians and so forth and so on. It really helped to legitimate the idea that film could be studied as an art form, like other art forms. And Bazin and his followers really helped develop this thing called the auteur theory, as I mentioned last week. The auteur theory, auteur is just author in French. And what it stipulates is that the movie director is the person most responsible for the artistic output of films. More so than this movie's writer, more so than the star of a film, more so than the producer of the film or the studio behind the film, that it's the movie maker who works in close consultation with other people like the cinematographer, like the editor, like the people who light the films and all kind of things like that. Ultimately, it's his or her responsibility for the artistic output of films. And that if you carefully look at a person's output over years, you can see repeated techniques and repeated themes and styles. And the personality of that particular filmmaker, regardless of the genre, will become evident if you look carefully at his or her films over a period of 10 years or so. So Bazin and Cahiers du Cinéma give cinema a kind of academic place, a scholastic place. It raises the reputation of motion pictures as something to be studied seriously alongside some of the other more standard and traditional art forms. That was prologue to the film, The 400 Blows. Now, what gives the film The 400 Blows its special meaning in this era of the late 50s and early 60s is mainly the idea that the film was so divergent from then contemporary Western films. When I say Western films here, I don't mean cowboy films. I mean films in the West, west of Greece, European films or American films. It is so realistic that it almost feels like a documentary in 1959. It is so ambiguous as to what was going to happen to this particular character. It's so sympathetic to the notion of a coming-of-age film. And it's so open-ended. It ends we're not knowing what to feel. It's a whole different kind of feeling in this particular film. Now, I wasn't even born when the film was made. I know I'm an old fart, but what I'm getting at is it's hard for me to contextualize just how different and fresh and so divergent from the stagey, Hollywood-esque, or even French version, Paris-esque stagey films that were being made at that time. And just to reiterate from last week, some of the strengths of this particular film, as the boy goes from really feeling a certain degree of not being loved by his mother, only tolerated by his stepfather, making some stupid decisions here and there, having some bad luck here and there, and really feeling this sense of dismay when he's growing up and confused and very sad. Okay? That's a hard thing to make a movie about. And what was so revolutionary in some ways about the movie is just how carefully it situates itself almost as realistically as possible. And just that goes hand in hand with Bazin. Bazin was a realist, and he was a humanist, but a realist. And just a couple of things to let you know why this film garnered the reputation that it did. It's shot all on location. Okay, there's no studio shots in this film. There's no sound stages in this film. It has somewhat improvised dialogue, which was very rare at the time. The music in the film is almost universally somber and somewhat sad. And that adds to the tragic sense of what's going to happen to this boy. It has a good deal of handheld camera to give you the feeling that you're capturing reality, that you're almost like a fly on the wall of this Parisian upbringing. And it has many very long takes of the camera. I mean, some really long takes, particularly that shot at the end of the film when he's running, when he escapes the detention center and he's running and running and running and running and running. I mean, Truffaut probably went a little bit overboard in demonstrating the overt sense of realism, that you have to be patient, yet it seems so fresh and so new at the time. Okay? So these are some of the things that give the film a kind of starting point of this thing called the French New Wave. And the French New Wave, and the French New Wave is one in a continuum of new waves that happen in the post-World War II period that makes filmmaking come alive with that generation of filmmakers. It takes it in some slightly different directions, okay? And there are a number of filmmakers in France who help elevate this idea of the French New Wave, and just different ways of seeing things and different storylines and realistic storylines, and sometimes not so realistic storylines, but storylines that had to do with a feeling of a generation changing and really tapping into the sense of that it was their time to say something true and spirited about French life during the 1960s. And some really interesting movie makers came out as a result of this. Another one is Jean-Luc Godard, who's still alive. And he made a film the same year or near the same year called Breathless, which is really an outstanding film in a lot of ways, but it's a little strange. It's almost like it's got a lot of character and very interesting, but it's also a bit bizarre. And there's some films by Eric Rohmer, Agnes Varda, and some other interesting movie makers during this time period who are very, very influential. And some of the movie makers that, in fact, all of the movie makers that America produced of great renown in the 1960s, which some of you are in the 60s film class that I have on Tuesdays, virtually all of them say that they grew up watching the French New Wave. They were all influenced by Truffaut and Godard. They say that all the time, because Truffaut and Godard changed some of the rules of filmmaking by not sticking to standard scripts and not sticking to standard shooting practices. And they were really revolutionary in a lot of ways. The French New Wave is a very, very interesting time period in movie making. And it goes hand in hand with the sense that movies became more artful and more thoughtful rather than just vehicles for entertainment. And Cahiers du Cinéma, which means cinema notes, was the scholastic side of that, the academic side of that, the artistic side of that, to garner its reputation as something worthy of study. And the French New Wave filmmakers were the proof of that cinematically. And it's an interesting timeline, because the French filmmakers were all influenced a decade earlier by something called Italian neorealism. Although we haven't gone over Italian neorealism, that happened right after World War II. So you have Italian neorealism, French New Wave, then the American New Wave, and a little bit of a British New Wave in there as well. Okay, that leads you to like the 1970s. Okay, that should be a decent point to end with this particular film. You have a lot of aspects there to ponder. I hope if you didn't see it, I hope you get a chance to see it. It's touching. It requires some patience on your part, but it's a touching film, and you have to contextualize yourself as a cinema person in the early 1960s to have some sense of appreciating how that film helped to that film and other films helped to change European filmmaking and filmmaking ever since. Okay. Now moving to chapter 10. Sorry, not chapter 11, but chapter 10, ideology. Um, Ideology is something that we all possess, even though we may not be aware of it. Um, Ideology, in some ways, has to do with this. If you were to boil ideology down into kind of one sentence, it would be the political way of life that you inhabit. Now, some of you may be interested in politics, other you may not be interested in politics, but even if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you, okay? Politics is about who makes the decisions in a given society. And art reflects political reality, whether you like it or not. All films have a political sensibility, even if they're not about politics. They reflect certain ideas in the culture that we take for granted or we absorb as we go from being little kids to older kids. I mean, for instance, you all know I have a 12-year-old daughter, right? So what is the ideology of raising a daughter in contemporary America, right? So when Molly was 2 and 3 years old, it was almost inevitable that she would read these Disney books or see these Disney films about princesses. Okay. Now, I didn't have any major problem with Molly, watching Cinderella or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or whatever. But at the same time, as she became a little older, I would ask her a little bit about like what do we understand from that particular story, right? You know, how does Snow White even know if she likes that prince? She only met him once. How does Cinderella really know if she likes the prince? She had a few dances with him and then she had to leave. Ideology is the stuff that we take for granted. That's the way things are without really questioning it, right? I think I used to read a Barbie book to her, and I don't like the Barbie ideas, but I wanted her to at least enjoy some of her childhood. So I would make a game out of it. I would read a little bit of a Barbie book where Barbie was talking about makeup with her sister Skipper, and then I would kid around and go, and then Barbie farted. Oh my God, it really smelled terrible. How could someone so beautiful make such an awful smell? Did she actually poop in her pants? And of course, my 4-year-old daughter at the time would laugh her head off at fart jokes. But I wanted to kind of demystify the idea that Molly felt like she had to be perfect, and only beautiful and only wear certain kinds of clothes, to demystify that ideology. Right? Now, we don't often think about ideology because we're just busy living in a life, whether we're white or black or Hispanic or Asian or men or women or gay or straight or rail skinny or really blubbery or whatever. There's all kinds of ideological stuff that happens. And movies reflect that sense of ideology, right? And chapter 10 tries to talk about a handful of those ideas about how films reflect ideology. And today's film, or tomorrow's film, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have seen, is, I think, a very good teaching tool about ideology. Because on one level, Forrest Gump is a delightful film. It's a perfect Hollywood movie. It's an A-level cast, A-level budget, sympathetic story, terrific acting, pretty good special effects for the time period, and a story that's moving and sympathetic to the person who's totally and completely innocent. It's terrific. It's terrific Hollywood movie making. It really is. But there are so many ideological aspects to Forrest Gump that really need to be investigated if we can understand how films kind of cheat on history and cheat with political ideology. And Forrest Gump is a film that does that very well because it masks what it's doing. And I'll get to that toward the end of this particular lecture. But that's the reason I choose the film, because it's so loved that I think it's worth exploring some of the issues in Forrest Gump from an ideological perspective. Anyway, on page 405, Giannetti gives 3 different kinds of degrees of ideology, and he calls neutral, implicit, and explicit. Neutral, implicit, and explicit. Now, you should take a gander on page 405 to see what he says, but I'll break it down this way. Neutral films, in terms of ideology, are films that are purely escapist and light entertainment. musicals often. Maybe some of your Marvel comic book movies or Batman movies, those kinds of films. Although I'd argue there's some ideology in there. Um, that you don't really think about them too much. There's a good 30% of movies that are like this, maybe even more. Okay, movies that are just silly or fun or pretty basic or without too much to think about. Light romantic comedies, or even those have some political ideas. But generally speaking, neutral films that have no real political sensibility to them are neutral. Implicit is a little bit different. Implicit says the protagonist and antagonist represent conflicting value systems, but they are not dwelled on. We must infer what the characters stand for as their tale unfolds. Nobody spells out, quote, the moral of the story. The materials are slanted in a particular direction, but transparently without obvious manipulation. Okay. If you take a film like Dope, for instance, from a few years ago, I mean, Dope is somewhat political, but it has a more implicit political message. Okay. Other lighter films that you may have conflicting values in it, but generally speaking, it's not about a political sensibility. Okay. But there is a message of some political sensibility in them. And then there's explicit films, which are films that are essentially about politics or a political idea. And here they talk about Oliver Stone's JFK, John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, or a film called Casablanca or Fahrenheit 9/11. Okay? When they're explicitly about a political theme or a historical theme, that's pretty explicit. But implicit is, maybe a drama that's vaguely about some bad company, and a good guy wins. But what's implicit, it's sort of hidden a little further in. Okay, so those are three areas in which you can think about the ways in which ideology work in films: neutral, implicit, explicit. And then he gives some terrific examples on films that fulfill those categories earlier. Okay. Okay. Or in 406, 407, let's talk a little bit about that. Okay. Over on 411, page 411, there's what's called an ideological spectrum. And I will show it to you in the camera in a minute, but the ideological spectrum is left, center, right. Now, I assume you know what I mean when I say left, center, right. Vaguely speaking, left is liberal policies, democratic policies, pro-gay, pro-abortion, pro-higher taxes on the rich, less money for military, fairer tax system for people. Whereas the right is Republican and conservative and the opposite of things that I mentioned a minute ago in terms of their political planks. And then you have centrists who are a little bit of both. And they give some readings here, the center, left, center, right model in terms of where some films fall under that category. Now, it goes all the way from communist to fascist on one level. And communist films, they actually have movies made by communists in the 1920s called October. And in the fascist side is a movie made by the Nazis in the 1930s also. But in between there are some other films that fall into maybe socialist or liberal or theocratic or conservative. And then centrist is something called that's like completely down the middle. Now, the films that they give examples for, you're probably not going to know too many of them. Although you may, one of them is It's a Wonderful Life. For our purposes in here, I think we want to talk about the difference between liberal and conservative. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But let me just show you what I mean in terms of this particular pattern here. Okay, so I know this is kind of goofy, but you'll see here the right-hand side in the center, and then on the left, and then communist to the end of the page and fascist to the end of the page. And liberal and conservative and centrist are kind of in the middle. And what I want to talk about as we move forward is really the difference between liberal ideologies in films and conservative ideologies in films, and maybe centrist ideologies in films. Okay, but that's generally what we're talking about. Now, what Giannetti does, and I think he does a very nice job over the next handful of pages, is he talks about ways in which we can think about how films can be categorized politically or ideologically. And from pages 412 to about 419, 412 through 419, 412 through 419, he gives some ways in which you can think about films along a spectrum of ideology. And over on 412, he talks about films that are either democratic or hierarchical, okay? And he tries to talk, just as an example here, let me read. Leftists tend to emphasize the similarities among people. We all eat about the same amount of food, breathe the same amount of air. Likewise, leftists believe that society's resources should be distributed in roughly equal portions, as implied in a movie called The Human Condition and Paxati. Authority figures are merely skilled managers and not intrinsically superior to people they're responsible for. Okay? Rightists emphasize the differences between people, insisting that the best and the brightest are entitled to a larger share of power in the economic pie than less productive workers, as implied in Henry V. Authorities should be respected. Social institutions are guided by strong leaders, not the rank and file of average citizens. So, you don't really think about this when you go to the movies, but if you start to think about the films you can see how it is that ideology works. You can say to yourself, does this film talk more about democratic principles, that we're all the same? Or is this film trying to emphasize that not everybody's the same? Some people are brighter, smarter, richer, and they deserve it. It's interesting. Okay? This is the way you can kind of start to think about how films represent themselves, what ideology means and how it's demonstrated, right? Environment versus heredity. This is a long-standing argument in human nature, right? Whether the place we're born into and the wealth that we have or don't have, the area we grow up in, the parents we have, the friends we have, the churches we have, the synagogues and so forth, that's our environment. Or is it all just hereditary? Is it all just based upon genes passing down from your parents, right? And there's ways in which you can determine those differences, okay? A lot of films about race talk about that idea, right? There's a silly comedy with Eddie Murphy about that very bet made by the two white guys in Trading Places. Relative versus absolute, okay? Relative, flexible in judgment, absolute or is not. It's either this way or that. It's either good or bad. Absolutes or relative. Who knows? Secular versus religious. Secular meaning of the earth, of people. Religious meaning of a certain kind of religious belief in a particular kind of God. There's all kinds of different ways you can think about the ideology of religion as opposed to no religion. And they give some very interesting examples about that. Future versus past. Ways in which the past have been shown, ways in which the future is to be shown. It's an interesting idea in terms of ideology, okay? Cooperation versus competition. Leftists consider cooperation an interesting idea. Rightists consider competition much better. Some films show either or. Films have political ideology. Films have ideas. Now, my sense is you probably won't have seen too many of these films, but even if you haven't, you can get a sense how they represent themselves with these very, very good pictographical examples. Outsiders versus insiders, okay? International versus nationalistic, okay? I think that'd be an interesting idea in terms of our contemporary times, the way in which our nationalist idea is demonstrated. And sexual freedom versus marital monogamy, okay? Ways in which the battle of the sexes between men and women are demonstrated traditionally, or whether they're not. These are just some ideas that you can think about in terms of how you can understand the ways in which films can actually be ideological, okay? And there's some very, very good distinctions and comparisons and contrasts with different kinds of films. I really, I implore you to look at the ways in which these films are described in the pictorial examples, because the textbook's pretty long and some of the information is will drive you crazy. But the examples are perfect. I mean, I think they're really perfect. Like, let's look at It's a Wonderful Life. It's a film that most of you have seen. It's a Wonderful Life is described in terms of its ideological positions, okay? It's over on page 415. There's a little picture at the end of the movie when all the people come in and give George the money to help him because his uncle lost the money. Capra, that's the filmmaker, was a foremost American film spokesman for conservative ethics, stressing such traditions as Americana as good neighborliness, faith in God, committed leadership, and family values. He championed such middle-class ideas as hard work, frugality, and healthy competition, but also generosity and wit. A character's wealth is measured not by income, but in terms of his or her family and friends. Capra's ideal was a romantic past of small towns, Christian values, close-knit families, and supportive neighbors, right? Now, that's a rather conservative viewpoint, and Capra was really quite good at that kind of stuff. Some people find these movies a little corny, but they're touching because they present a particular kind of ideal, right? Most of you have seen It's a Wonderful Life, right? And if you've had any sense of remembering that film and what happens to George Bailey his whole life, he's trying very hard to do the right thing each and every time. And other than getting very lucky and marrying Mary and really loving her and having, children, he never got anything that he really wanted. He wanted to go out in the world. He was pretty smart. He wanted to make a decent amount of money. He wanted to shake off the little blues of a small town, and he was never able to do so. And when the money is lost and Mr. Potter has the money and everyone comes to his aid, it's a touching film. It makes us feel as though we recognize the good in him and that good is returned to him. And that's a very sweet and also rather conservative viewpoint, right? Now, try to think about that film in terms of realism. Or try to think about that film in terms of, I don't know, perhaps if it were done a different way. I mean, it's really not likely that all those people would happily hand over much of, a decent amount of their money to George to reach $8,000. But that doesn't matter, right? It's a movie. It's conditioned on tapping into our sentiments, and it's conditioned on a particular kind of ideology, because the ideology says this works, right? The ideology says these basic small-town Christian values work. And whether they do or not, that's up for grabs and up for the idea that civilization's been dealing with since we crawled from the slime. But in terms of how it's represented in a very conservative viewpoint, which is fine. I'm not saying conservative bad and liberal good or liberal bad, conservative good. I'm giving monikers to them, okay? But I would really encourage you to look at these pictorial examples because they really spell out the idea of ideology quite well, okay? The rest of the chapter is very good. It's very good, and it visits some aspects of feminism toward the end of the chapter and talks about women's lives being demonstrated more interestingly in contemporary times than in the past. And the idea of feminism is pretty interesting. We'll talk about feminism a little bit with Forrest Gump. And there are examples of feminism that are very critical of films that aren't feminist enough and films that have characters who are feminist heroes. And also toward the back of the chapter, they talk about something called queer cinema, which is a movement that happened in the early 60s, but then it happened again in the 1990s, where the idea of homosexuality as represented on screen has changed significantly as homosexuality in the culture has changed significantly in terms of its ability for homosexuals to become much more mainstreamed in American society. And they talk about representation of these kinds of films, and films sometimes you don't think of as people who may be homosexual. And they give a very, very interesting idea about queer cinema in the back of the textbook, in the back of that chapter, I should say, the last part of the chapter, okay? If you're interested in a terrific documentary about representation of homosexuality in cinema, it was from 20-some years ago. It's called The Celluloid Closet. You can probably find it online somewhere. Very good film. Okay, so the ideology chapter, it's a good chapter because it gets you thinking. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Forrest Gump in terms of its ideology. I assume you've seen Forrest Gump. Go ahead and watch it again. It's really a well-crafted movie, directed by Robert Zemeckis, Zemekis, I think. Zemeckis, something like that. 1993 or 4? I should look that up. Is it 3 or 4? I always forget. Where's my syllabus? I guess it's not that important. Where's my syllabus? There it is. 1993, okay? Now, the movie's made in 1993, okay? It's a huge international hit. Wins Oscars. Tom Hanks wins Academy Award, his second Academy Award. And everybody loved it. Terrific movie. And it is. Much of the film, made in 1993, is about the changing times of the 1960s, right? Much of it starts a little earlier than that. It starts in the 50s when Gump is a child and he has polio, or not polio, he has the screwed up back and he has the braces on his legs. But generally speaking, it really goes from about 1955 to essentially contemporary America in the early 90s, right? And much of that is the 1960s and early 70s, okay? Now, what's intriguing about that is that what the film Forrest Gump does is it, through the lens of Forrest Gump's memories and Forrest Gump's narration when he sits next to all those people at the bus stop, and it's he who's telling the story historically, right? What he's doing is telling the story of the baby boom generation, more or less, and all the tumultuous changes that are happening in the latter 50s and all through the 60s and into the 70s. But the film is showing us Gump's version of these events, which, are on the level. They're said in good faith. Right? It's Gump doing this, right? But the thing that's intriguing about it is how it is that Gump, who is a sympathetic character, who is totally and completely an innocent character, has a debilitation in that he can't really think well. He can feel, and he has gut instinct and gut feelings, but he's slow-witted. He has a very low IQ. He can't think for himself, really. He's a hard worker. He's a good person. He's honest. But he's an innocent, and he's an innocent thrown into a time period which was really not innocent, right? A time period that was filled with a great deal of change. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War and the difficulties in the Vietnam War, and the post-Vietnam War era, and the third wave feminist movement era, and toward the end of the film, the era of AIDS, okay? Now, when Gump goes back and you find him in all these historical points, he always comes out okay, right? Gump, who can't think, finds his way fine and lucks into getting a scholarship at the University of Alabama because he can run real fast. Finds his way through Vietnam because he can run real fast. Falls back into money with the shrimping boat business because of the hurricane, whatever hurricane that was. Falls back into money more because Lieutenant Dan decides not to kill himself and puts money, Gump's money away in Apple computers. Finally has Jenny by his side and comes all the way through with some heartbreak on the other end because Jenny dies. How are the people who represent the 60s represented, right? They are represented in a very negative way, right? Jenny's boyfriend hits Jenny and he blames it on President Johnson. The Black Panther Party is seen as menacing to Gump or menacing to that whole situation. The civil rights movement is all boiled down for Gump to just pick up a book for a black woman, right? The post-Vietnam War, even the Vietnam stuff it's somewhat gritty for a minute there, but it's all about Gump being a hero by being able to run quickly, right? And the point at which, at the protest in Washington, where Gump is finally going to say something that means something, what happens? They pull the plug on him, quite literally. And once they pull the plug on him, anything that he has to say that he can think about is nullified by the movie. And then Jenny walks across the water, skims across the water there, and everyone goes, ah, right? Think about Jenny. How is Jenny represented in the film? Jenny is poor, like Gump is relatively poor, but Jenny's father is a child molester, we're led to believe. Jenny has no mother. Jenny wants to stay away from her father all the time because he's touching her all the time. Jenny then becomes a broken woman. Even though she has feelings for Gump, she knows that Gump can't think. And then Jenny becomes a kind of flower child hippie, moves to San Francisco, goes to Los Angeles, lives this transient life, gets into drugs, can't figure her life out, right? Then she produces Gump Jr. and then summarily dies of AIDS. Like, think about if you're the woman playing that role, would it ever occur to you that, geez, in an era of changing time and feminism, why is Jenny only victimized? And why is Gump, the guy who can't think, get everything, right? And it's weird because what the movie does in its own subtle way for 90s audiences is it takes a kind of look back at the 60s, and its ultimate message is they were messy. That was messy. That civil rights movement, that was uncomfortable, wasn't it? I'm glad Gump got out of there okay. I didn't want to have to face the idea that maybe we have a racist, section of the country that wouldn't let people vote and they would get killed for it. I'm glad that part's over with. The Vietnam stuff, that was messy. But Gump was heroic, good, because he could really run fast. What was Gump's opinion about Vietnam War? I don't want to hear it. Then it becomes too much of a real movie. It's better when it's a myth, when it's a fantasy, when it's Gump not thinking his way all the way through. See, all the changes of the 60s are seen through the eyes of a person who can't think, and it's all gauzy, like a Hallmark card of the 60s. And the things that made the 60s valuable and important and changing were the struggles, not the getting out of the struggles, right? So what Forrest Gump, the film, does is it kind of plays an ideological trick on audiences of the early 90s. It gives a historical viewpoint of the 60s as too easy, as too messy and not nice for someone who can't think. Meanwhile, the person who can think, it seems as if she was put on earth to produce Gump Jr. And why doesn't Gump Jr. have AIDS? I don't understand, right? She has AIDS. Why doesn't he have AIDS? Anyway, don't get me wrong. Forrest Gump is an interesting film. It is. It's a pleasurable film. It is. But its ideology is too simple. Its politics are too simple-minded. The way in which the people who helped change things in the 60s, the way they're presented as problems. They're presented as a problem for Gump and Gump's world. They're presented as negative. Now, ask any black person whether they think the civil rights movement was negative. No, it wasn't. I mean, it had negative aspects to it, but its ultimate fight was to get rights for all human beings to have equal access to the institutions of American life. And the way in which the feminist representation of the film is totally victimizing. She's just a victim the whole way through. And Gump is an innocent who floats like his little Curious George feather from his book, right? It plays a trick on audiences of the 1990s. It simplifies the difficulties of the 1960s. And I would argue that the representation of the changeable 1960s in the film Forrest Gump follows a rather conservative viewpoint, because Gump's successes are him escaping the dangers that the rest of the country went through in the 1960s, and all those assassinations and the Vietnam War protests and the feminist movement, and to some degree the gay rights movement, although it's not mentioned in the film, and the drug movements and so forth. Okay, Forrest Gump is an A-level Hollywood movie that's very enjoyable. The music is really good in Forrest Gump. The musical score, it's so subtle, and how it sort of bends your emotions to feel for Gump. And Tom Hanks is very good in it, and it's likable and everything, but it's too simple. Not that all movies have to create every history perfectly, right? But when you go out of your way to treat things that were changeable and valuable and make them too simplified for the mind of a simple person, it kind of cheats that history. It whitewashes history in a way that is I would argue, in the conservative spectrum. It's a conservative film, okay? So take a look at Gump and take a look at those pages that I mentioned to you here today, okay? Couple of things. There's still a number of you that have not handed in your test from like 2 weeks ago. I've tried to contact as many people as I could. I haven't gotten in touch with some people because I just can't get their phone numbers. You know who you are. I don't know what's going on, but you have to send them to me. Please make sure you're looking at your emails. Please make sure you're looking at your NCC email accounts, okay? Another thing is, please don't forget about pre-registration. It's very important that we pre-register for classes for the fall semester. I'm not sure if you guys are all comm arts majors. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. I'm not 100% sure. I'd be happy to go over any transcripts with you or degree evaluations. You can't let it slip by. It's almost May, and I think I mentioned to you up on the page on the web. For some reason, all of our classes just say staff. That's not the case. I'm teaching the normal classes. Peter and Jen are teaching the normal classes. We have three journalism classes, one journalism 121, the basic one, and then media writing and digital journalism are being offered in the fall. Please sign up for those classes. You can do it online. If you can do it online, please. Well, you have to do it online, right? I don't know what's going to be happening in the fall. I don't know whether or not we're going to be in the classroom. I would hope so. I just don't know. It's just Corona stuff just won't end. But even if we're not, you're still going to need classes. And you're going to need your maths and your sciences and your liberal arts and your humanities or whatever. Please email me. Let me know where you stand. Please don't wait until the end of the semester. I know that the CARES Act went through and some monies are actually coming into your pockets from the United States government for financial aid. Not enough, but something. And, we need numbers for the fall. I'm also teaching a summer class. I'm teaching it online only. I have to learn how to use Blackboard. I've never used Blackboard. I did want to use Blackboard, but I have to learn how to use it because there will be no summer classes in the classroom this summer. The summer class I'm teaching is a film studies class. It's Communication Arts 256, focus on the director. I'll be doing it all online through Blackboard. I have to figure out how to do that. If you want to take that class, please do. I normally would be able to buy you bagels and donuts every Thursday, but I won't be able to do that. Maybe I can send everybody, some gift cards or something from Dunkin' Donuts. But at any rate, that pre-reg stuff is very important. You really have to make sure we pre-reg in the spring for the fall. Okay, that's pretty important stuff. And I'd be happy to go over what you need. Okay, just email me. I mean, maybe we could Zoom or talk on the phone or whatever. I don't care. It's just that barely anybody has pre-regged yet, and normally we would be talking about this in the classroom. And I don't know how many of you are watching these videos for how long. All the information's here. So we only and we have a final. Let's see, the final will be where's my syllabus? The final will be the 14th. That's right. We have a silly reading day. Next week is the last film, Citizen Kane, and then 5/7 is reading day. That'll be weird. And then 5/14 will be the final examination. Maybe I'll even send them. I'll send the examination out before that, so you guys have more time to do it. But please be safe. I miss you guys. I do. I miss the classroom desperately. I never knew how much I missed it. But if you're not well, I'm very, very sorry. You're my thoughts and prayers. With anybody in your family is not well, the same thing. And if you are well, do try to remember that, like, this really stinks, but if you're well, man, that's what's important, because I've had a number of my students, 5 or 6 of them, who have gotten this COVID, and it is pretty hard. I mean, and God hope you don't get it, or if you don't have it, you have a kind of underlying condition, because it's pretty bad. So just keep that in mind, and keep your mindset about doing your work at home and your computer time, not Instagram time anymore. Like, you got to be doing your homework. You got to be doing your schoolwork. Okay, and we'll all get out of this together. Okay, so I'm going to send you an email letting you know this is up, and be well. And for those of you who haven't sent me that second test, man, you got to do it, or just email me. Just let me know. All will be forgiven. When you ghost me like this, I don't know what to do. I don't. I've called several people a few times, and no answer, no nothing, no email back. I hope and pray you're not sick. Okay? Have a good evening. Bye-bye.